Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth, and we're going to pick up now with the second episode, second installment, talking to Warren Rothman about his book. Well, about his book, Kafka in China, but really about his experiences that led him to writing this book, which concerns just this horrifying, surreal, almost mind-bending experience that he had. That's, my terminology, having listened to him and talked to him about it, where because he ends up inadvertently in possession of information about a multimillion-dollar bribe that has been paid and therefore has become a threat to, well, I'll just leave it as shadowy interests in China. A whole series of events happen. He's targeted in a variety of ways and ultimately locked away in what amounts to a black prison, sort of disappeared, and probably with the goal initially of killing him. That's a real quick summary of what happened. This being, of course, after Warren had been in China for quite some time, knew the country, spoke the language. But I encourage you, if you're listening to this installment and you haven't heard the first episode, at this point, go back and listen to the first portion of this account, because I think that's really the way to appreciate this, and then pick it up here where we are now. Warren, welcome.
Thank you, Sam.
So, as I say, I raced through that introduction a little bit because I don't think there's really any way to do justice to the story other than telling people, hey, start by listening to the first installment of this, and even in the first installment, as much time as we put into it, I am well aware from reading your book and talking to you off air that there's a tremendous amount of detail that we just didn't have time to go into, that I would just say to the listeners, just all of that detail just makes the story that much more powerful and compelling. But where we left the narrative at the end of the first segment was, after a whole series of events, you have been locked away unwillingly, not of your own accord, in what amounts to a black prison. You have been beaten, tied up, injected. We sort of teased the fact that you were ended up only being there, only in air quotes, only for 10 days ultimately. But again, to make clear to the listeners, that's because you got yourself out with some assistance, not because that was the limit. And certainly there was never anybody saying this is only going to be for 10 days. So you're in this facility, you've been locked up, you're being mistreated. Let's just start with this. You ultimately get out in 10 days. How did you do that? How did you get out of there at all?
So I've been beaten and tortured and injected with something. I have no idea what it is, and tied up in this hospital-type bed, hand and foot. And what's going to happen to me? Of course, at that time, I thought I was really going to die. That very night, I thought I was going to be put to death, actually, with a second injection that had been referred to by one of these nurses that had been involved in giving me the first injection. So I didn't die, and luckily, I really was nothing wrong with my mind. And over the course of a few days, that became very apparent to the people who were holding me. So it seems to me always that the first hope of these people, Q and the people he was working with, was that I would die, and that'd be the easiest way to explain how I just died of a stroke, hopefully, is what would have been the explanation. Long insomnia followed by a stroke. And So I was able to gather my wits to the extent I could. I thought I was going to die, but I decided I did not want to die, and I wasn't going to die if I could possibly help it. There was quite a struggle that night. I tried to get out of these bindings. I was put back in them. I struggled and tried to get out of them again. This hospital bed rolling all over the floor. So I guess I showed a pretty strong determination to not be killed. But at any rate, I survived that night. And as a couple of days go on, it's pretty clear that there's really nothing at all wrong with me. And meanwhile, my partner, Fred, has been told that I would have to be in this place at least 30 days. And so he wired 30 days worth of money.
Okay, so Fred, excuse me, but Fred is stateside. Fred is in San Francisco at this point. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so he's halfway on the other side of the world, feeding. I mean, what he knows is whatever he's getting, whatever limited information he's getting at this point. He's not, and he's not. Is he talking directly to you?
No, and all of this information is in delayed time. So everything he's being told might happen or is happening already has happened.
Right,
so
right.
At any rate, he has no choice but to follow their instructions, so he sends the money for what they said would be a cost of a 30-day confinement in this place. But as I said, as a couple of days went on, they start untying me and letting me out of this bed. I show that I'm really quite unwilling to die, number one, and also acting fairly normally.
Right. You're not going to die. You're not going to make it easy for him. And by the way, it's pretty clear, hey, this guy isn't crazy, and he's not going to pretend like he's crazy.
But once you're in a place like this, yeah, exactly. So once you're in a place like this especially, it's not that easy to kill somebody outright and get rid of the body. There has to be a certain accountability even there.
Right. By this point, there's a lot of other people that have seen you. I mean, this is no longer a conspiracy involving a handful of individuals, if it ever was. So this is getting harder and harder to cover up as time goes by, is what I'm hearing.
I think you're right. Actually, exactly, Sam. That's a great point. So yes, it's harder and harder to cover up, and also, they have to make a certain explanation for why some foreigner died. So it becomes easier, I think, to just simply say, "Oh well, they threw me in this mental hospital." And that, therefore, anything I might say about what had happened or whatever had been blurted out to me about that bribe was just purely the product of a deranged imagination or mentality. So I wind up only staying there 10 days. And Fred comes over. He's told that he has to come to receive me, to take me out to the airport and fly off. But, in fact, there's no armed guard going with us. There's no indication of any sort of urgency on the part of the Chinese to just see me off to the plane in handcuffs. So, at any rate, that's how I got out, and it's just simply a question of having survived what they were doing to me, and having been determined just not to succumb. Trying everything I could in my willpower.
Well, you ultimately get out in 10 days, and then I assume you went stateside at that point.
Exactly.
Okay, now I want to walk through, again, I'm going to tell the listeners here, the book, Kafka in China, you need to read this. This is a true story. It's very powerful. It's very well written. It's definitely worth your time, and it's an important story because of not just that it happened to an individual and people should be aware of that, but what it says, this is me opining now, but what it says politically beyond that about what can be done to anybody in these kind of circumstances. So with these kind of apologies that I am going to jump around a little bit just because there is so much ground to cover, let me focus on a few things here. You're an American citizen. You're on Chinese soil. You end up in a facility, turns out it's a mental institution, but frankly, being used as what amounts to a black jail in this case, a place to try to disappear you. I agree with you, probably initially kill you. there's a U.S. consulate, and the consulate becomes aware of this. In other words, there's an office of our State Department there, and its job, of course, a big part of its job is to tend to the care, the health and safety of American citizens. Is true in any country. And the consulate, as I understand it, becomes aware that you're there, and consular officials actually come and see you while you're in confinement. And what happens when they do that?
Well, this one guy comes over with a woman. He gives me a business card, I guess, and he introduces himself as a consular officer. This woman in tow with him, he describes as quote unquote almost a nurse, quote unquote. And this so-called almost a nurse is there, I think, just to sort of eyeball me and confirm something that the consulate had already done that I didn't know anything about, which was to issue 2 letters that were indispensable to getting me committed to this facility in the first place. It's not that easy, even in China, for a private person, almost anybody, to commit someone to a mental hospital. There has to be some type of documentation. And especially in Shanghai, and especially concerning a foreigner who they're much more likely to have to account for.
Right. So this is one of the many junctures in your story that I just find mind-boggling. Not in the sense of being hard to believe, but in the sense of just what the import is, I suppose. Because what the upshot of this visit and them coming and meeting with you is that they don't get you out. They don't spring you. They don't show up like the cavalry and rescue you. In fact, when it's all done, and both this meeting and the documentation, the letter that I know you've seen that they created. I mean, what really you realize ultimately is no. It's not only that they're not here to rescue me, but they're they're party to this. Is that too strong?
No, not at all, because unless these letters are forgeries, and that's something we're going to be discussing, because that's the whole involvement of the U.S. side of this, the U.S. governmental side, particularly Senator Feinstein, part in this, that comes up later, that whole issue as to how how this
Right,
all
but
plays out in the
these
U.S.
people came and saw you, and you have in your possession now, right, the letters that they created that essentially facilitated you being confined.
That's right. I found those in 2012, which was one of the things, my finding them was one of the reasons that propelled me to go public with this story to the journalist Joel Brinkley.
So we have a situation where you become privy to this information that I alluded to earlier. Then all of a sudden, the whole series of events we talked about in the first episode occur, culminating with you being forcibly grabbed and shoved into a black prison. Again, I'm laughing not because there's anything funny, but just because how extreme it is that you're deprived of your liberty, you're confined, you're disappeared, and then we discover, and the consulate is aware, does nothing, visits you, doesn't get you out. And in fact, in retrospect, now you're aware that, well, no, they also prepared documentation really to facilitate this happening. So, I mean, I guess I keep coming back to this point because it just still kind of blows my mind. I mean, here are the U.S. officials who are supposed to save you. I mean, that's their job, but they don't save you. And in fact, it turns out ultimately we now even have documentation to show that they facilitated this. But there's no.
The man who showed up this two pair, this man and woman
Right.
from the consulate, the man was actually one of the signatories of one of the letters.
Right. And so he's facilitated you being disappeared, my terminology, but there's no semblance of anything we would recognize in the United States as a proceeding that to protect your rights to determine the facts. I mean, you were physically grabbed and dragged off to this facility,
Oh yeah,
right?
I'm sure. I was tortured at that facility. I
Right.
was injected with something in that facility. There was nothing at all normal about what happened.
Okay, when these people are talking to you and you're there in this institution and you've gone through hell and been injected and beaten and tied up and everything else on top of what happened to you before you got in the facility, they express any concern about what should have been, I mean, I would assume would be your obvious physical condition at the point. I mean, it's not as if they found you looking, chipper, I'm sure. Nobody goes through what you've gone through that you've described and doesn't look, well, like they've gone through hell. Does that worry
No, they
them or
didn't
bother
really.
them?
No, exactly right. I mean, I thought I had the sense that this woman, almost a nurse, she was just there to kind of confirm what they had already said in writing, never having even met me.
Yeah, this is like I say, this is the whole purpose of Department of State officials in this position is to safeguard the rights and the security and the health of American citizens, not supposed to be there to validate Chinese authorities or make it easier for them. And it is not as if this would be the first time that somebody has been confined unlawfully and immorally on Chinese soil, so that shouldn't have been some great revelation to them.
Well, in fact, that's a truly notorious practice, Sam, in China. I could send people documentation 2 feet high of cases of people just thrown in for one reason or another. Whether it's even to the extent it's not just political dissidents or people, it could even be a relative who has money that someone wants to grab and they throw the relative in, or something like that. I mean, it's unbelievable what actually happened.
Right. I mean,
But
it's
that just doesn't usually happen to a foreigner, a so-called Lawai. That's why special procedures had to be taken with me.
so the bottom line is when they're all done here, I mean, it turns out the Department of State actually issues documentation, issues a letter to facilitate you being locked up, and then they come and see you, and they don't lift a finger to get you out. That's the bottom line.
Not a thing. No,
They walk.
nothing.
So this all happens. You're locked up. They come see you, and then it's like, adios, and they're gone, and you're still on your own. So let me jump to. Well, I want to talk about Senator Feinstein last. So relatively briefly before we get to that. Um, in retrospect, I mean, now this is, you have the passage of time and the information you've been able to collect, and also the benefit of being able to just, clear your head, look back on events with 2020 hindsight. These surreal events that we have talked about now over 2 episodes that just don't really make any sense as they're happening because they just. Do you have any theory? I mean, now can you make any more sense of it? Have you been able to conclude, at least to your own personal satisfaction, a little more about what happened and why it happened?
Yes, it took some time. It took a number of months, really, after I got back to the U.S. And all the time that I was going through all this trauma in China, being dragged through the streets of Shanghai at 2 a.m., dragged from this apartment, thrown into or shown or almost pushed into a total of 4 black jails, and the 4th being this mental hospital. There's only one thing that explains how I survived all of this and how I was feeling very good during a period of more than 2 weeks of almost complete insomnia, which ordinarily makes me quite depressed feeling. But I was feeling very up this entire time. There's only one thing that explains the physical resilience and energy that I had in light of that helplessness and in light of the threats that I was facing. I mean, I'm not the type of person to belly up to a gang of 10 or 12 or 15 thugs. I'm not the kind of person that would ordinarily find himself, especially with sciatica, stenosis of the spine, almost crippling problems, actually, at times, running on practically bare feet and moccasins, really, through the streets of Shanghai at 2 a.m. for my life. While I was being tied up in this mental hospital and tortured, the thugs were talking about waiting for 4 hours before I would die. They just had to wait for 4 hours. They kept telling each other. And eventually it dawned on me, wait a minute, they were waiting for me to have a stroke. Why would I have a stroke? And anyway, what are they talking about the 4 hours? Well, it was something I had already discussed with both Q and the housekeeper, the IE. That is this drug called TPA, tissue plasminogen activator, which can arrest or even push back certain types of strokes. So they knew that I was very concerned about that from a prior episode having nothing to do with this, but that was something that they knew. And so why were these guards talking about my dying in 4 hours? Well, tissue plasminogen activator to be effective has to be given within 3 or 4 hours, or the stroke becomes irreversible. So all of these things never really made any sense. But finally, it dawned on me one night as I was going to sleep in May of 2009, 5, 6 months after I get back, and it had to be ephedra. It had to be that they were feeding me ephedra. I putting it in my food for weeks, Q putting in food that he happened to bring over after the IE absconded. His sidekick S had an opportunity to put it into my tea and my coffee as we were going from place to place on the final day that I was out in relative freedom. And it just came to me that there was only one thing that could explain all of these things. And it is, in fact, ephedra, and they had expected it to cause a stroke. But in fact, it had the opposite effect. It had the effect of giving me tremendous energy, physical strength, endurance, and a kind of courage that I never would have ever had, I'm sure, without the effect of that drug.
So you're looking back on this and feeling like, in essence, not in essence, straight up, they were poisoning you over a period of time, figuring this will ultimately accumulation of this, and this guy's going to stroke out, and that's going to solve our problem.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's I figured it out. I pieced it together, and that was really the only thing that made sense in terms of how I felt, how I reacted.
Well, and certainly with ephedra, I mean, especially if you had any predisposition to insomnia, but I mean, ephedra is going to keep you from sleeping. That's going to keep you jacked up and wired.
Well, yes, exactly. And insomnia is, a lifelong problem for me, and both of them knew about that too. So it was a natural to choose this.
So let's bring this around to sort of, I would say close on this, but I want to talk about it thoroughly for as long as it takes us to talk about it. Let's talk about Senator Feinstein. We've teased this or touched on it or alluded to this in the first episode and already in this one. Now here we're talking about a lady who is, well, one of the most powerful politicians in America, but also somebody who has very well-known and very extensive ties to China. What's her connection to this? What is her involvement in this? Or her culpability in this, whatever the right term is in your eyes?
The culpability is actually blocking any investigation from the U.S. side, especially whether these consulate letters were actually forged or whether they were genuine, starting with that point, but blocking any investigation into what happened to me, affirmatively blocking, taking actual steps after having been intimately informed of the details. And I can go into the reasons for this allegation.
No, please do. I mean, because this is, that's why I say I want to, let's take the time to address this. I mean, what we're talking about there, as I understand it, is, okay, fine, after this is all over, in the aftermath of this, she's not only, the matter is brought to her attention. She not only doesn't take action to investigate it, you're saying affirmatively, she blocks follow-on investigation. Am I understanding that?
Yes, correct. I believe that's absolutely correct statement.
Lay that out for us.
Okay, in early 2012, I discovered these two letters that I referred to earlier, that we discussed earlier, from the consulate, ostensibly from the consulate, on U.S. consulate letterhead, and with apparent U.S. consulate seals, that commit me to the care of this Q, who's the blurter of about the bribe, committed to his care, a Chinese national whom one must think these people don't have any idea who he even is until he walks in the door and gets these letters. But
right, and as you noted, just to make this clear, I mean, people should go back and listen to the first installment. But just to be clear, I mean, Q is, we're using that as a designator or a throwaway name here, is the guy who is, he is the one, as you just indicated, who brags to you about having made this multi-million-dollar bribe, apparently expecting you to think he's a rock star and did something cool. And it's you not only not thinking that, but kind of berating him for having been involved in illegal activity that triggers this whole series of events. In other words, what I'm saying is the last person on planet Earth that we should be saying is being entrusted with any authority for your care would be the guy who, it's pretty clear, is at the heart of everything is happening to you. The guy who is doing everything to you. The American consulate issues a letter saying, yeah, we're entrusting you with this guy's care. That's where we are. That's how insane this is. So you discover the letters. I'm sorry, you said 2012.
Yes, February 2012.
All right, and then pick up the narrative there. I just wanted to make sure everybody was clear on how amazing it is and how egregious it is that these letters were issued and who they were issued to.
Fine. It's a vital point. So a bunch of events happen, very serious events happen in the U.S.-China relationship. There are all kinds of revelations about the human rights abuses, a new wave of them that's been going on, including mental health abuses of the type that happened to me. And there's a whole surge of new information, and then a couple of really dramatic events happen. Neil Haywood's murder is disclosed, and that bears very, very eerie similarities to mine in that he was poisoned, only he died, and he came back. He was involved in some corruption. That's a difference from me. I didn't have anything to do with it. But he was involved in some corruption, allegedly, and then he was poisoned, and that whole case blew up because it was done by the wife of an extremely high-level official, upturning the whole history of China, in effect. So that was a very dramatic event involving poison, and then all of a sudden the blind lawyer shows up in the U.S. Embassy, and he's shown the door, ultimately, by a Secretary of State who's more interested in, some sort of useless dialogue with the Chinese than protecting a really key human rights individual and victim of this regime. At any rate, all these events conspired to make me feel like I really ought to go public with my story. So I contacted Joel Brinkley, who was a superb journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner, and at that time had been a New York Times columnist, but this time he was a professor at the Stanford School of Journalism. So I met with Joel, told him my story, showed him some evidence of documents that I had, and Joel agreed to write an article about the case, and it appeared in Politico on June 30th, 2012. Well, as people know, Politico is really a backyard magazine for just about everybody in politics, and especially in Washington. So it'd be inconceivable that Feinstein staffers would not have found this article. At any rate, after that article was published, I met with a friend of mine, and happened to show him the article and talked about the case. And he said, this friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, knows Senator Feinstein really well. Well, I knew that too. And I knew that this mutual friend of this friend of mine who's now passed away, named Bruce, he and I both knew that this other friend was very close with Feinstein and her husband. So Bruce said he suggested we have lunch with this third fellow, and we both knew him actually when I was a member at the Bohemian Club. So we were very good friends. And so we have lunch with this third person at his lordship's restaurant over in Oakland, and I go through the whole story chapter and verse all over again. And this friend of Feinstein's, an intimate friend, said, gee, this is a horrendous thing. We got to bring this to the attention of the senator. So that's very early July. I give him a package of documents for delivery to the senator. I get intermittent emails about hoping to arrange a meeting, something or other. In July, this friend of ours, the contact with Feinstein, is involved in a bunch of activities that take a lot of his time. So in between, I'm getting letters saying he's gotten the package to Feinstein's husband, Richard Blum, that he's spoken with Richard Blum about the case. This is by July 23rd, 2012. And Blum's response is, yes, this sort of thing happens all the time in China, and there's one reason that Blum, no longer does business in China. And Bruce, the intermediate friend, agrees that he'll write a specific letter forwarding my information to Blum for his inspection. Now, frankly, I never understood, and you'll see why later, why Mr. Blum was at all involved in this.
Right. He's a private citizen that has nothing to do with this.
I mean, it doesn't seem to me. This friend of ours also knew the senator, and I was told several times that the senator was present during a very extensive presentation that this friend made to her and to Mr. Blum about what had happened to me, that she had sat through the whole thing, however long it took. At any rate, so I'm getting this thing, and I'm not getting any real result, though. And so I decide to file a petition with the Office of the Inspector General at the State Department. That's on July 18th. I get no response to that. So I prepare a petition to the what's called the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which has a responsibility to monitor and report on human rights abuses in China. All the while, throughout this whole procedure, I'm being very closely advised by an extremely serious Wall Street lawyer, a mentor of mine, a former chairman of a major Wall Street firm. I'm not proceeding in any way carelessly. I'm sending petitions wildly to this person and that person. It's all a very well-considered process of trying to get some answers. So on August 5th, I file a petition with the so-called CECC, the Congressional Executive Commission on China. On August 7th, I get a phone call from our friend. Let's call him X, okay? X says, Blum is appalled, quote unquote, really pissed off, quote unquote, about what happened to me. Quote, how big does he, that is me, Warren, want it to get? What do I want to do about it? I have really extensive notes of this call. Blum asks for a more detailed statement of evidence than the one that I provided in my August 5th petition to the CECC. And, you know, in retrospect, that was just complete nonsense. Everything that I provided to Blum in this reshuffled document, that's all it really was really right there anyway. And it was just, to my mind, just a delay tactic. But at any rate...
right, and once again, we just said this a few minutes ago before the record, Blum is not, he's a private citizen, right?
That's right.
I mean, we're not hearing from Feinstein, we're not hearing from the Congress, but this private citizen Somehow the communication is being routed through him. That's yet another bizarre chapter. But anyway, continue, please.
Yeah, and it continues this way. Well, okay, pursuant to that August 7th call, I send 3 faxes. One is to someone in Feinstein's San Francisco office. That includes the CEC petition that I had filed on August 5th and other documents, and faxes to 2 people in the State Department. Meanwhile, I neglected to say that in that August 7th phone call with this ex, the friend of Blum's and Feinstein, Blum told him that he is good friends with someone who is in charge of U.S. missions in China. So I don't know whether one of these people to whom I was sending in Washington, at least, the 2 people there, whether any of those were people that related to Blum's claim that he knows he's the person in charge of U.S. missions. I don't know who these people were. I never heard anything back from any of them. So August 10th, I provide this so-called description of evidence, and I prepare a revised petition for CECC just to make sure that what they have is what Blum and Feinstein have. There's really practically no substantive difference at all, though. It just looks different. So August 14th, I get a call from the 3 top staffers at CECC. The top administrator, his assistant, and the chief legal counsel of this CECC. We have at least an hour-long conversation. I go into chapter and verse what happened to me, and their answer is, gee, we don't have any sort of view, no sort of program scheduled for any sort of abuses of foreigners, of Americans in China. We're really focused on what's happening to the Chinese. I said, oh, that's really nice. Don't you think it's important that this be investigated, the sort of thing that could only grow in severity?
I don't even know what that means, since every U.S. mission, having served in embassies all over the world, every U.S. mission, consulate, embassy on the planet has as its core function providing American citizen services to U.S. citizens abroad. That is a core function of every Department of State facility on the planet. So
well, it's really interesting that these staffers had no idea of that basic principle that you cite.
Oh my
very
God.
validly cite. You very validly cite it. At any rate, August 15th, so they say, sorry, it's not on our radar. We'll, keep us posted, whatever. Nothing ever transpires out of that. But this call, remember, Sam, has come out of the blue, and it's not just a letter. It's not just a note. Sorry, we received your petition. We're looking. It's 3 top staffers to tell me there's nothing I can do about it.
Right. So the 3 top staffers can take the time to call you, which means somebody's worried about something or it's gotten somebody's attention, but they can't then actually lift a finger to do anything for you.
Right. They tell me they can't. They
Right.
tell me that.
Right. I can take the time to call you because somebody at some level has had their cage rattled and is worried, but I'm not actually going to do my job and get the U.S. government to take care of its citizens. All right. I got it.
Okay, so August 15th, I file an amended petition the next day. In other words, after that phone call with the ECC, I prepared the petition anyway, so I filed it. I emailed a copy of the amended petition to the Office of the Inspector General, State Department. I sent a separate cover letter to Blum with, via my friend, care of my friend, with documents including this amended petition. Okay, nothing happens. September 8th, I get a call from my friend X. Hi, Warren. An email. I just returned from the Cal football game where I was a guest of Dick Blum in the new Chancellor's Suite in the newly renovated stadium. He told me that Diane now is informed of your experience and that she has assigned the matter to her chief staff counsel for investigation.
Diane is, of course, Senator Feinstein.
Yes. That's always how this friend referred to her. He was that close to her. They were really, really bosom buddies with this
Right.
guy.
No, I just mean for the listeners, I want to make crystal clear. So we
Yeah,
now have the definitive proof that, I mean, you've been talking to, it's been clear that she's in the loop all along, but now we have confirmation that
right.
she has
There's
this
not
and
even the
she,
slightest doubt.
right,
Not even the slightest doubt.
right.
So, and she's assigned it to her chief staff counsel for investigation. Then
Okay.
this email proceeds. Just what will come of this is hard to predict, and as I've said before, things will move slowly. However, I thought that I would give you an update.
Okay.
Very kind of him. I was very grateful to this friend, and incidentally, this friend acted in 100% good faith throughout. I think that he was completely used by Blum and Feinstein.
Right. I should add
And anyway,
another caveat I want to add to the listeners. The decision to not name this individual that you keep referring to by this designator was a deliberate decision and one that you and I discussed beforehand. And it's not, nobody should take that as an indication that there's any lack of, any question that this individual exists or it has anything to do with his credibility. It just has to do with, it just has to do with at this point protecting a certain degree of protection and concern about retaliation and things like that. But in any event,
thank you
okay.
very much for that clarification.
Yeah, I just don't want people to think, okay, look, so we got somebody that we're calling X. Does this guy even exist? That's not a question in this story, and there are reasons why that name is not being used right now. I'll leave it right there. So we've got to the point where Feinstein knows, and I'm gonna jump in a little bit here again, just because there's so much detail. I mean, ultimately, what is the disposition? I mean, Feinstein now knows she has it. She's assigned it to her staff. What does she do about it?
Nothing. In one word, nothing. I never hear a word from anyone again. None of the people that I was told to fax copies to at State, at Feinstein's San Francisco office, from Feinstein, from Blum, from my friend through Blum, nothing, absolutely nothing. And I certainly tried to follow up. Now, Sam, here's the real kicker. On September 30th, okay, this call from my friend X is September 8th. September 30th, Joel Brinkley writes a second article pursuant to discussions that I had with him over the summer. And in this case, it's a 4-page insert in the Sunday section of the San Francisco Chronicle Insight section. It occupies the cover of this sort of magazine sort of thing and most of 3 pages inside. So
Okay, this is a huge article, obviously by any estimation, in the flagship newspaper on Feinstein's home turf.
Precisely.
I mean, this is okay, so you can't miss that. You can't possibly not see that, and everybody in town presumably can't avoid seeing it. And that produces what reaction?
Nothing.
Unbelievable.
I send the article, of course. I do everything I possibly can to try this channel or that channel to get their attention. Nothing. No reaction. Zero. CECC, a closed door.
Yeah, they had time to call you, 3 of them, and then no time or energy or initiative to ever do anything. As you said, by the time they were done talking to you, they told you, we ain't going to do anything for you.
Precisely. Exactly said.
I just absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, I wish I should say it was unbelievable, but it is, of course, not unbelievable. I again, just emphasis for people listening to this, as you're listening to Warren talk about filing this petition and that petition. I mean, you're an attorney. You had been practicing for a very long time, a considerable period of time at the time that this all occurred. I mean, in other words, what I'm saying to you folks that are listening to this is not some guy at home when he says he's writing a petition or writing a letter, that's somebody with no legal training and no background who's just kind of winging it and writing down a complaint. If he's talking to you and telling you he's writing a petition, well, and it's a legal document, well, that's exactly what he means when he's saying that. Am I right? I mean, to understand the import here. This is a guy who knows how to convey arguments, to be crystal clear, to to bring together evidence, to make points critically, all that stuff they beat into your head in law school, and then you learn in the trade. So that is what is being conveyed to all of these people that they decide to just simply ignore and walk away from.
Right, and it's not just me with all the advantage that I have of having legal practice to write such a petition, but every single thing I'm doing is being reviewed by a really, really close friend who's a really senior lawyer on Wall Street. This is not an amateur act. It's really a serious effort.
Yeah, and the U.S. government can't lift a finger. So to this date, nobody's ever done anything.
Absolutely nothing.
Right. So we had an American citizen is abducted, beaten, terrorized, threatened, drugged, injected, very close to killed. But for the grace of God, maybe you just go under and never surface. And you successfully bring this to the attention of the Congress of the United States, to one of the most powerful senators in the United States Senate, yada, yada.
Devoted supposedly to human rights. Remember,
Yes.
Feinstein's calling card used to be how, she really protected human rights in China.
Yes, exactly right. When we're supposed to be the ones calling other nations, this is supposed to be what we stand for, is standing up for human rights around the world. Even when we're talking about folks that are not U.S. citizens, and yet here is one of our own citizens, and apparently we're not going to do anything. Not at all. Why do you think so in her case? I'm asking you for an opinion now. I know you don't know. Why?
Having been completely apprised of this situation, I can't believe that she would not do something except for some reason that's not so good to think about, and that involves her husband's business interests in China and with Chinese in the United States.
Yeah, unfortunately, I would have to agree with you. I don't know either, but that seems to me to be the reasonable conclusion at the bottom, and unfortunately something that I think we have seen in, unfortunately, a lot of other people and corporations in this country. There's so much money and tied up, and they are so in bed with the Chinese Communist Party that we're not gonna break any eggs here. We're not gonna rattle this cage. That's more important to us, the business dealings, the relationship, and the cash, than protecting our own citizens on foreign soil.
It's a very sad statement. It's true, and it's a very sad statement. And I think also at the time, the Chinese economy looked so strong in comparison to the U.S. There were just endless tsunami of Chinese money pouring into the United States. I'm sure that Feinstein thought that money coming into California especially would make her look good somehow. I think it strengthened the U.S.-China ties, and she was undoubtedly, from that standpoint alone, probably not very happy to see something like this disrupted, because I think it's fair to say that if this news had been given proper prominence, it could have been extremely disruptive to the relationship.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you. I think that the nature of the direction we have taken in our relationship with the Chinese Communist Party for a number of years, in my view, just Sam opining, is predicated on people this kind of thing not being brought to the attention of the average American, right? Because this threatens all of this relationship. It threatens everything.
That's right.
People are going to. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry, Sam.
Well, I was just going to say that because it's all of a sudden people think, wait a minute, who are we doing business with again? What is the cost? What are they doing to our people? You begin to question these things. Well, we know how much money a lot of people are making off of this, but I'm not against people making money, and I'm not against big business, obviously, But at some point, when you're beginning to sort of sell your soul and sell our own citizens down the river, well, something's gone wrong. Something's gone off the rails there.
Certainly summarizes my view, Sam. The money involved is just staggering, and it took such enormous issues like the crackdown in Hong Kong, the brutalization of up to 3 million human beings in Xinjiang province, incarceration of them, and all kinds of horrendous mistreatment. It took all that breaking out for any of these people to take any kind of view at all on the human rights situation there. And, I would suppose that my situation is hopefully not a very common one, but it's very increasingly so. There are examples of Americans being locked up for supposed drug crimes that their relatives and lawyers and friends in the United States say it's absolutely impossible that they did. These are pretextual things that Americans are going to be increasingly subject to.
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, as I said earlier, the government exists to take care of its citizens. The Department of State exists to take care of our citizens abroad, in part, and yet nobody's lifted a finger for you here. Actually, I guess the Department of State did lift a finger. They lifted a finger to help the Chinese lock you away. They jumped into action long enough to assist the Chinese in mistreating you. So
for the longest time, I thought that those letters were forgeries, and they really may be. But the reaction of the State Department, the non-reaction, the reaction of Feinstein tells me that there might have been some misfeasance by the consulate in issuing those letters. I just don't know. That was really one of the things I was most trying to find out: are these letters real or are they forged?
well, I know this one. This is your story, and I don't have any independent knowledge of that, and I'm not going to pretend to. But I do know that you have read the text of at least one of those letters in its entirety to me, and I know that I worked in and out of embassies for a long time, and everything about that letter. I haven't physically seen it, but we have talked about it, and everything about the text of that letter rings exactly right. Word choice, composition, style. If it's not legit, then it's very well done, because that's exactly what would be created, and it would say that, and it's just mind-boggling that it was. Warren, listen, I think that's where we're gonna close, and I really appreciate the time you've taken here, because I know it's an important story, and I know you'd still like to see some degree of reckoning, but I also understand these kinds of things are, on some level, the kinds of things that people don't like to talk about and don't like to dredge up all over again. And you've been kind enough and honest enough, and I don't know, feel like, I guess, dedicated enough to the subject and the cause to do that and talk about it at great length. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam, for the opportunity to do so. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.